Ancient Egypt is remembered for pyramids and pharaohs, but almost no one talks about the women who were taken into temples and never returned. They were not criminals. They were not prisoners of war, they were offerings. Tonight, you will hear about women who disappeared in the name of the gods, erased from records, buried in silence, and forgotten by history. This is not speculation, this is documented. And what makes it truly disturbing is how carefully it was hidden. The story begins at the very birth of Egyptian civilization in a time we call the early dynastic period, around 3,000 years before Christ. Egypt was unifying under powerful kings who claimed to be living gods. When these god kings died, they did not go into the afterlife alone. Archaeological excavations at Abydos, one of Egypt's oldest royal burial sites, revealed something that Egyptologists initially struggled to explain. Surrounding the tombs of the first pharaohs were dozens of smaller graves. Bodies of young women and men, buried in neat rows, no signs of trauma, no weapons. Just bodies, carefully arranged, sealed into the earth at the same time as the king. Most of these bodies were women, young women. Some were buried with jewelry, which suggests they held some status. Others had nothing. The tombs do not record their names. They are not mentioned in inscriptions, they exist only as bones in the ground, evidence of a practice that Egypt would later deny ever happened. By the time of the Old Kingdom, the era of the Great Pyramids, retainer sacrifice had mostly stopped, or at least, it stopped being obvious. Egypt had become more sophisticated, the religion had evolved. Pharaohs were still gods, but now they had priests, temples, and elaborate rituals that required less blood. Women were no longer buried alive or killed outright beside royal tombs, but they did not stop disappearing. This is where the story gets darker, because it becomes harder to see. When something is public, it leaves evidence. When it is hidden, it leaves silence. And ancient Egypt left a great deal of silence around the women who entered temples and never came out. Egyptian religion was not one thing, it was not uniform. There was public religion festivals, statues, offerings of bread and beer. And then there was inner religion, the rituals performed in the innermost chambers of temples, where only the highest priests could go. The general population never saw what happened there. They were not allowed, even other priests were barred from certain rooms. What we know about these inner sanctums comes from fragments, inscriptions that hint, papyri that reference rituals without explaining them, archaeology that finds things that should not be there. One of those things is bodies, female bodies, found in temple complexes, buried in ways that do not match normal practices. Some are beneath temple floors, others are inside chambers that were sealed and never reopened. These are not the grand burials of priestesses or noblewomen. These are simple interments, quick, quiet, hidden. In the 1990s, excavations at a temple in Upper Egypt uncovered a chamber that had been walled off in antiquity. Inside were the remains of 7 women. They were young, between 15 and 25 years old. They had been buried without the usual funerary goods, without amulets, without the care that Egyptians typically showed their dead. Carbon dating placed them in the Middle Kingdom, a time of relative stability. There was no war, no plague, no obvious reason for their deaths. But they were there sealed behind a wall, forgotten. The archaeologists published their findings in a journal. They called it an anomaly. They suggested the women might have been temple workers who died of disease and were buried quickly to prevent contagion. But the location of the burial made no sense for that explanation. Disease victims were not sealed inside sacred temple spaces. They were taken outside, away from holy ground. These women were placed inside the temple, in a chamber near the sanctuary, as if their deaths were part of the temple's function, as if they belonged there. If you think this kind of hidden history is worth uncovering, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, buried in the records, waiting to be told. Egypt gave women more rights than almost any other ancient civilization. Women could own property, run businesses, initiate divorce, and inherit wealth. They could be doctors, priestesses, and even pharaohs. Hatshepsut ruled as king for over 20 years. Cleopatra commanded armies. Egyptian women were not invisible. But when the gods demanded blood, none of that mattered. The key to understanding this lies in understanding crisis. Egypt's entire existence depended on the Nile River. If the Nile flooded too much, villages drowned. If it flooded too little, crops failed. Egypt operated on a razor's edge between abundance and famine. When things went wrong, when the flood failed, when plague spread, when enemies invaded, the people turned to the gods. And the gods, according to the priests, required appeasement. There are records, fragmentary but real, of rituals performed during times of crisis. Papyri that describe offerings made to Hapi, the god of the Nile flood. Inscriptions that reference gifts of life given to ensure the river's return. Most of these texts are vague. They do not specify what the gifts were, but there are clues. A Middle Kingdom papyrus, damaged and incomplete, describes a ritual performed during a drought. It mentions pure ones being brought to the riverbank at dawn. It describes their ritual cleansing, the prayers spoken over them, and their descent into the water. The text breaks off. It does not say what happened next. But it does say the Nile rose 3 days later, and the priests declared the gods satisfied. Another text, from the New Kingdom, references a plague that swept through Thebes. The priests of Sekhmet, goddess of plague and healing, performed a ritual to stop the disease. The text says they required 7 without blemish to be brought to the temple. It describes them being dressed in white linen, anointed with oil, and led into the inner sanctuary. The text does not say they came out, but it does say the plague ended. Were these women killed? The texts do not say they do not have to. The silence says enough. The role of priests in these rituals cannot be overstated. Priests in ancient Egypt were not humble servants. They were powerful, wealthy, and politically connected. They controlled vast temple estates. They advised pharaohs. They interpreted the will of the gods, and they decided what the gods required. When a crisis came, the population looked to the priests for answers. The priests, in turn, looked to the gods, or at least, they claimed to. Oracles were consulted, dreams were interpreted. Signs were read in smoke and stars, and sometimes the answer came back that the gods were angry, that they required more than bread and beer, that they required life. The selection process was specific. Texts describe the criteria. The offering had to be pure. This meant young, usually. Unmarried, often free of physical defects. The term used in some inscriptions is perfect ones. They were inspected by priests, examined for scars or marks that would make them unsuitable. If they passed, they were taken. Did they go willingly? Some texts suggest yes. Religion in ancient Egypt was not a choice, it was reality. The gods were as real as the Nile, as real as the sun. If the priests said the gods required your life, refusing was not just disobedience. It was cosmic betrayal. It endangered everyone. Some women may have gone to their deaths believing they were saving their families, their villages, their entire civilization. Others did not go willingly. There are references in administrative documents to women being brought to temples. Not invited, brought. The word used implies force. One text from the late period mentions a woman who tried to flee a temple and was returned by local officials. The text does not explain why she was at the temple in the first place. It simply records her return and notes that the ritual was completed successfully. Like this video if you want more stories that history books avoid. The truth is often found in what is not said. The darkest aspect of this practice is how it was disguised. Egypt was a bureaucratic society. Everything was recorded. Grain shipments, tax payments, temple inventories. Yet there are almost no direct records of human sacrifice. No lists of names, no official accounts. This is not because it did not happen. It is because it was hidden, deliberate, systematic. When someone was taken for ritual purposes, their death was reframed. They did not die, they became divine. They joined the gods, they were transformed. This was not murder, this was ascension. The language used in temple inscriptions reflects this. Women who disappeared into rituals were described as entering the presence of the god or becoming one with the divine. These are not euphemisms, they are erasures. In normal Egyptian religion, death was a transition. The body was mummified, preserved, given tools and food for the afterlife. Names were inscribed on tomb walls so the dead would be remembered. Memory was immortality. But the women who disappeared into temples received none of this. They were not mummified, they were not named. They did not get tombs, they got silence. Archaeologists have found this silence. At the temple complex of Karnak, excavations in the 1970s uncovered a sealed pit beneath the floor of a side chapel. Inside were fragments of human bone, female yun, mixed with ash and broken pottery. The bones showed no signs of disease or trauma. They had been cremated, something Egyptians almost never did. Cremation destroyed the body, which meant it destroyed the possibility of an afterlife. The only reason to cremate remains was to erase them completely. The priests knew what they were doing. They were not ignorant or primitive. They were highly educated, skilled in medicine, astronomy, and engineering. They understood anatomy, they understood death, and they understood how to make it look natural. Some rituals involved drowning. The Nile was sacred. Dying in the Nile was considered a blessed death. If a woman drowned during a ritual, it could be presented as the gods claiming her, not as murder. Her body would be given a basic burial, and her family would be told she was honored by the gods. They might even receive compensation, grain, land, a position in the temple for a son. Silence could be bought. Other rituals involve poison. Egypt had access to a wide range of toxic plants, hemlock, henbane, opium in large doses. A woman could be given a drink, told it was sacred wine, and die within hours. The symptoms would look like illness, fever, convulsions, unconsciousness, death. No wound, no violence, just a body that stopped working. Priests were trained in medicine. They knew exactly how much to use. There are references in medical papyri to substances that bring sleep without waking. These are described in the context of treating pain, but the dosages listed are lethal. One papyrus describes a mixture of opium, mandrake, and wine that would allow passage into the next world without suffering. The text presents this as mercy, but mercy for whom? The most disturbing part is how accepted this was. We think of human sacrifice as barbaric, as something done by savage cultures. But Egypt was not savage. It was one of the most advanced civilizations in human history. It had law, art, literature, science. And yet, under the surface, it had this: the people knew, they had to know. But they did not stop it, because it was for the gods. Because it was necessary. Because the alternative angering the gods was worse. There is a text from the Ptolemaic period, Egypt's final dynasty, that describes a drought. The Nile had failed for 3 years. People were starving. The priests declared that Hapi, the god of the flood, required an offering. The text says the people gathered at the riverbank. A young woman was brought forward. She was dressed in fine linen, adorned with gold, and led to the water's edge. The text says she walked into the river willingly. It says she smiled. It says the water rose immediately and the drought ended. This text was propaganda. It was written to justify what happened. But it reveals the mechanism. The woman was made complicit in her own death. She was told she was saving everyone. She was honored, praised, elevated, and then she was drowned. And everyone went home believing the gods had been satisfied. Comment below if you think this was worship or murder. By the time of the late period, Egypt was in decline. Foreign invasions, internal strife, economic collapse. The old rituals were fading. Greek and Roman influences were spreading. Human sacrifice, if it had ever been widespread, was becoming rare. But it did not stop completely. It went deeper underground. There are Roman-era accounts of Egyptian rituals that disturbed even the Romans, who were not squeamish about death. One Roman official wrote about a temple in the Fayum where local priests performed rituals that he found abhorrent and contrary to civilized practice. He did not describe the rituals in detail, but he mentioned that young women were involved and that the local population avoided the temple after dark. He requested permission to shut it down. Permission was denied. The temple had powerful political connections. Another account, from a Greek traveler, describes witnessing a ritual at a temple in Upper Egypt. He says a young woman was led into the inner sanctuary and did not emerge. When he asked the priests what happened to her, they told him she had joined the god. He pressed for details. They refused to answer. He left Egypt shortly afterward and wrote that he would never return. These are not Egyptian sources. They are foreign observers who did not understand Egyptian religion and may have misinterpreted what they saw. But they saw something that disturbed them enough to write about it. Something that Egyptians themselves did not talk about. The archaeological evidence supports this. Even in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, bodies of young women continue to appear in temple contexts in ways that do not match normal burial practices. A 2003 excavation at a temple near Luxor found the remains of a woman buried beneath the threshold of a sanctuary. She had been placed in a fetal position, wrapped in linen, and sealed under the floor before the temple was completed. Carbon dating placed her death in the 1st century BC. She was approximately 18 years old. There was no trauma to the bones. No disease. She was just there, part of the foundation. This practice of burying someone beneath a building's foundation is called a foundation deposit. It was common in many ancient cultures. The Egyptians usually used animal sacrifices or symbolic objects. But occasionally, they used people, and most of the time, those people were women. Why women? The texts do not say explicitly, but the pattern is clear. Women were associated with fertility, rebirth, and creation. The goddess Isis, one of Egypt's most powerful deities, was a mother and a magician who brought the dead back to life. Hathor was the goddess of love, music, and joy, but also of destruction when angered. Sekhmet was both healer and plague bringer. Egyptian religion understood that creation and destruction were linked. Life required death, rebirth required sacrifice. Women embodied this duality. They gave life through childbirth, but childbirth was dangerous. Many women died bringing children into the world. This made them liminal figures, existing between life and death. It made them powerful, and it made them suitable offerings. The priests understood this. They selected women not just for their physical purity, but for their symbolic significance. A young woman, unmarried, represented potential, unfulfilled life. That potential could be redirected, transformed, offered to the gods. Her death was not an ending, it was a transformation. Or at least, that is what the priests told themselves. That is what they told the families. That is what they inscribed on temple walls in language so coded that only other priests could understand it. But the women themselves left no words, no inscriptions saying I went willingly, no letters saying I am honored to die for the gods, only silence. And silence, in a culture as record-obsessed as Egypt, is its own kind of evidence. The practice did not end with the arrival of Christianity. Egypt became a Christian province of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. The temples were closed. The priests lost their power. The old gods were declared demons. But the silence around what had happened in those temples remained. Christian writers occasionally referenced the dark practices of the old religion. They condemned the worship of animal-headed gods and the shedding of innocent blood, but they did not provide details. They did not name names. It is possible they did not know. The rituals had been hidden for so long that by the time Christianity arrived, even the memory of them had faded. Or perhaps the early Christians did know, and chose not to speak of it. Because speaking of it would mean acknowledging that these things had happened in the same temples they were now converting into churches. Modern Egyptology has been reluctant to fully engage with this topic. Human sacrifice contradicts the popular image of ancient Egypt as a wise, enlightened civilization. It is uncomfortable. It complicates the narrative. For decades, archaeologists found evidence that suggested ritual killing, but stopped short of calling it sacrifice. They used softer terms: ritual interment, votive burial, foundation offering, anything but sacrifice. This has started to change. New generations of researchers are looking at the evidence more directly. They are asking harder questions. Why were these women buried this way? Why were they not given proper funerals? Why are their names missing from records? The answers are difficult, but they are becoming clearer. One of the most significant recent discoveries came from excavations at a temple site in the Delta region. Researchers found a chamber that had been sealed in the Ptolemaic period. Inside were the remains of 12 women, all between the ages of 15 and 25. They had been laid out in a circle, heads pointing inward, each with a small offering bowl placed on her chest. The bowls contained traces of a substance that analysis revealed to be a mixture of wine, honey, and opium, enough opium to be lethal. The researchers concluded that these women had been drugged and died in the chamber. The chamber was then sealed. This was not a mass grave from a plague or a disaster. This was intentional, ritualized, planned. The discovery was published in an academic journal in 2011. It received little attention outside specialist circles. There was no documentary, no headlines, just a dry academic paper with photographs of bones and chemical analyzers. The women remained nameless. The reason for their deaths was listed as unknown ritual purpose. But we can guess the purpose. 12 is a significant number in Egyptian religion. 12 hours of day, 12 hours of night, 12 gates to the underworld. A circle of 12 women would have been cosmically significant. Their deaths would have been seen as creating a portal, a connection between the human world and the divine. The chamber they died in was located directly beneath the temple's sanctuary, the holiest part of the building. They were quite literally the foundation of the temple's power. This is what makes the practice so disturbing. It was not random. It was not barbaric. It was calculated, symbolic, and deeply embedded in religious logic. The priests who performed these rituals believed they were doing something necessary. The women who died may have believed it too. And the civilization that allowed it to happen, one of the greatest civilizations in human history, simply looked away. Egypt left the world pyramids and sphinxes, golden masks and painted tombs. It left a legacy of art and architecture that still inspires awe. But it also left unmarked graves, bodies beneath temple floors. Women with no names, no tombs, no memories. They were offerings. They were erased. And for 3,000 years, the world forgot they existed, until archaeologists started digging, until researchers started asking questions, until the bones started telling their stories, and now we know. Ancient Egypt, for all its grandeur, for all its wisdom, for all the rights it gave women, still found ways to take those rights away when the gods demanded it. Still found ways to make women disappear, still found ways to call murder sacred. The temples are ruins now. The gods are silent. The priests are dust. But the women are still there, beneath the sand, beneath the stones, waiting to be found. Each excavation reveals more. Each new discovery adds another name to the list of the forgotten. Except they had no names, so we number them instead. Woman number 1, woman number 7, woman number 12. They deserved better. They deserved to be remembered. They deserved to live, but they were born in a time and place where the gods were hungry, and priests decided what the gods needed to eat. And what they needed was life, young life, female life. Life that could be taken quietly, ritually, and buried in silence. This is the history that Egypt does not advertise. This is the story that does not appear on tour guides or museum placards. This is the dark truth beneath the golden facade, and it is real. The bones prove it. The temples prove it. The silence proves it. If this kind of hidden history interests you, consider subscribing for more stories that history tried to bury. Because the past is not always glorious. Sometimes it is just dark. And sometimes the only way to honor those who were forgotten is to remember what was done to them, no matter how uncomfortable that memory might be. The women who walked into temples and never returned deserve to be known. Not as numbers, not as anomalies, but as victims of a system that valued divine appeasement over human life. A system that lasted for thousands of years. A system that we are only now beginning to fully understand. And that understanding begins with one simple acknowledgement: it happened. They died, and no amount of golden masks or painted walls can cover that truth.